Okay, over to you, Madina.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Saturday lecture. Thank you for being here. The Saturday lectures are brought to you by the Social Sciences Lab, a non-profit initiative that aims to support research, training, and network among social sciences researchers in MENA region. We are affiliated to Fatima Al Fikri University, a non-profit online international university which believes that education should have no borders and quality education should be accessible by youth around the world, especially those from developing countries. The Saturday lectures are open access lectures aimed at providing our students and members of the public with an understanding of social issues relating to the Middle East and North Africa region. The first duration of Saturday lectures took place from March to September last year, and we are into our second duration in 2021. So today here we have here with us our guest speaker for today, Professor Habib Haque Khondker. Professor Khondker is professor of social sciences at Zayed University, United Arab Emirates, and co-chair of Research Committee 9, Social Transformations and Sociology of Development at the International Sociological Association. Also, previously, he was an associate professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore. Also, some of his recent works include Globalization, East and West, 21st Century Globalization, Perspectives from the Gulf, COVID-19 and Governance. Soon after the COVID-19 pandemic struck, globalization, as we know, was declared dead. This was not the first time globalization was pronounced dead. Globalization was pronounced dead following the global recession of 2008, and terms such as deglobalization were used after the financial crisis of 2011. Will globalization survive post-pandemic world? Professor Khondker, thank you for being here today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Madina, for your kind introduction. And I'm going to use some slides that I have. So without much ado, I would show you the slides. But before that, I want to thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and very noble, sort of program. Because spreading education, having a conversation across borders is a mission that I am personally interested in, and ISA, International Sociological Association, that I represent, has taken up this to be one of its goals, to spread conversations across borders. So I'll just get into my slides because that would facilitate, sharing our ideas. So please let me know whether you can see my slides. This is the...
Yes, we can see.
You can see the slide. Okay. So I'll just start without much ado. So the topic is titled Globalization versus Deglobalization in the post-pandemic world. And you may have noticed that I've been part of a book we recently did on COVID-related response in the context of globalization. And this is an issue that has been on our mind, that is globalization going to survive the pandemic? So when we planned this talk months ahead, this was the talk, this was the title. Pandemic was on everyone's mind, but now things have changed post 2/24/2022, and I'm referring to a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which Russia calls a special operation. And war, as you have noticed, the recent remark by Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he calls it an absurdity in the 21st century. But this is a reality that we cannot escape from. So the war in Ukraine looms large, literally this is the bear in the room, which we cannot overlook. So the question is, can globalization survive the pandemic and the Ukraine war? The talk of deglobalization has become louder, especially since the war broke out in the February of 2022. But the talk of globalization and deglobalization began much earlier. It was mentioned very frequently in 2017. The vice president of Bolivia declared globalization as an ideology is dead back in January 2017, 5 years ago. But the same year, the Foreign Affairs magazine published a series of articles on deglobalization. So the discussion whether globalization is dead or in decline began much earlier. And at that time in 2017, I recall the point that they were referring to was Brexit, and the Brexit referendum took place in 2016. Donald Trump became president of the United States in 2016, who would be remembered as one of the most protectionist presidents, anti-globalization president. And those were the markers, those were the evidence that people used who were, behind this idea that the world has been on a different path other than globalization, and they defined it as deglobalization. And many writers were saying that, globalization is dead, and they were trying to support that with all kinds of evidence. Now, during COVID-19, which broke out, as you remember, in December, but for the rest of the world, it was early 2020 when COVID came to everyone's attention. By March, this became a global pandemic. And since then, 2020 has slowed down the flow of international trade. The logistics were in the front line of wreckage, all kinds of problems in global supply chain. Tourism, hotel industry, they were very badly hit. But at the same time, we can see that online business flourished. Amazon.com became the #1 company and so on. So the impact, although in general, it led to a huge decline in global economy, but all sides of global economy, all sections, all sectors of economy were not affected equally. So as we go on, we'll see that, I don't know whether I can, yeah. So the question is globalization over? So like Mark Twain's death, the demise of globalization is an exaggeration. And Brexit might have hindered regionalization, but other forms of regional global cooperation continued, and we can go and check these facts, but I'm not going to dwell on that. But what I'm going to suggest that there's not one globalization, but many globalizations. So the leading journal in this field is actually called Globalizations, to indicate, to flag the plurality of this concept. So, okay, and the main point that we hold, we meaning sociology community as a whole, that globalization cannot be reduced to economic globalization. And the mission or the main task for us is how to rescue globalization from a narrow reductionist definition, which is basically financial globalization and economic globalization. So I did a quick Google search. I put deglobalization and I got 203,000 hits. And then I put hyperglobalization, which far exceeds deglobalization, 3 million. And then I put globalization. And I think if my numbers are correct, it's in the region of 2.8 billion. So you can see that at least online, globalization is still alive, but deglobalization is making its appearance. So when you look at pandemic recovery and the war, the fact is, I mean, these are facts that we cannot deny, that global GDP contracted by an unprecedented 3.3% in 2020. That's a fact. So the global economy experienced a robust growth of 5.1% in 2021. And then in 2022, the projection was very, very optimistic in the beginning. And then suddenly, the war came and no one could predict, no one could see what's happening. And IMF has already revised the growth rate from 4.4 to 3.6%. And we all know that the disruptions would be in the supply of corn, gas, metals, oil, and wheat. So both natural resources, especially food, will be affected, supply of food, and that may have consequences leading to famine in some parts of the world. But I think since we already know that and the international community is aware of that, so adequate steps should be taken to prevent that disastrous outcome. That's my hope. And I hope that expectation, that optimism materializes. Now, there are three views on the subject of deglobalization versus globalization. View one, that globalization has been in decline and the process of deglobalization has been in motion for the last 2 decades. It's not post-COVID, not post-Ukraine war. View two, globalization will survive pandemic and the Ukraine war will make it change course, but globalization will survive the turbulence. Because we have had, and economic historians tell us that there was a period of globalization before World War I. It was dented, it was affected by World War I, and then after war, we had another round of globalization. But I'm not going into that economic history of globalization in particular. Now, view number three is the above two views, view one and two, define globalization primarily in economic terms and overlook the larger historical process of globalization. Globalization as a macro historical process will continue unless we take a leap into the collective insanity of a nuclear holocaust. So barring that, globalization will continue. So let me elaborate these three views. View one, globalization has been in decline and the process of deglobalization has been in motion for the last 2 decades. Supply chain disruptions, surging costs, shortages of commodities, these daily realities could all be connected to a process known as deglobalization. And some experts even see the war in Ukraine combined with the pandemic as marking a turning point toward a deglobalized era. This was from a discussion in Deutsche Welle recently. So globalization is dead thanks to Vladimir Mirovich, who is the name of Putin. I was going to say Lenin. A title of an op-ed column. The COVID-19 virus caused huge disruptions to global supply chain. Trade wars, pandemic, and invasion exposed the acute vulnerabilities of global supply chains. So those who were critiques of globalization, they were pointing out that interdependence has its own vulnerabilities, and once these vulnerabilities materialized in terms of disruptions, they began to say, didn't we tell you that it's a risky world? As of April 11, Yale University statistics indicate that more than 600 multinational corporations have divested from Russia or ceased operations, and this includes McDonald's. And you remember in 1990 when McDonald's went to Russia, this became the marker of Soviet Union, now Russia, becoming a part of the globalized system. So these deglobalization forces could have profound and unpredictable effects, according to China Daily. Then Russia-Ukraine conflict may trigger deglobalization came as a heading, and this was a quote from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Indonesia. So as I said, IMF global forecast has been downgraded. We have already discussed that. So if we look into view one, globalization has been in decline, okay. Then supply chain shortages and so on. I mean, these are very clear indications, but these indications are temporary. These are not dislocations forever. And I can just give you one example that even if you want to onshore, rather than offshore, some of the production activities such as iPhone, and how many countries are involved as suppliers of different components to this little machine, you'll be surprised that it would be almost impossible to make it onshore, especially in the United States. So you can reshore, that's a possibility, but complete onshoring would be a huge challenge, and it would not make any sense economically. So the view too is globalization will survive pandemic, and the war will make it change course. So there was a title in Globalization Isn't Over, It's Changing. This was an op-ed in the New York Times by Peter Coyne. And then another writer says, talk of deglobalization is fashionable but wrong. And they try to make those arguments by using, the good old economics of comparative advantage and so on, because you cannot defy those sort of axiomatic truths of advantages, comparative advantages and so on. So it would be like going backward, going back into the mercantile era. And in the 21st century, it doesn't make any sense. But we are not getting into that economic argument, the in-house debates, because I'm not an economist. I'm a kind of amateur reader of what's going on in the economics, in the discipline of economics, especially pertaining to globalization. So I would not venture into those debates. But my point is that both these definitions, point view, point two, they pivot on the economic definition of globalization. They look at globalization primarily in terms of FDI, flow of foreign direct investment. They look at world trade, trade as percentage of GDP or trade as volume of trade. So they primarily focus on those economic indicators, and they could say, okay, the trade has gone down, trade has gone up. And based on that, they jump into the conclusion and they pronounce whether globalization is dead or alive and kicking. They ignore what we look at as historical aspects of globalization. We look at globalization as a historical process. Globalization as a macro historical process will continue unless, as I said, we take a leap into the collective insanity, collective madness might bring it to an end. But other than that, it will continue. So here you look at some of definition. Chatham House defines deglobalization is a movement towards a less connected world, characterized by powerful nation states, local solutions, and border controls, rather than global institutions, treaties, and free movements. Given the demographic situation in the world, fertility declining in certain parts of the world, fertility is high in other parts of the world, it would be inconceivable that the movement of people will slow down at any point in the future. So is the world in a period of deglobalization? As they say, some consider the world to have entered a period of deglobalization, and they give these indicators, as I said, Brexit, Trump, decline in FDI, and so on. But it would be wrong to say that the world is definitely in a period of deglobalization. Phenomena such as COVID-19 pandemic response, if you think about it, there was a great deal of international cooperation, and people downplay, again, for ideological reasons, that within weeks after the detection of the virus in China, Chinese scientists shared the genome of this virus with their colleagues, namely the international community of scientists worldwide. And that led to the invention of the vaccine. So that aspect is often de-emphasized, and we hear a lot of stories about how China wanted to suppress. But the fact is the genome of the virus was shared internationally within weeks, is ignored, So the point is, and again, in terms of vaccine, of course, we have vaccine inequity and so on. but the scientists across the world, were in conversation. There was a great deal of communication, great deal of fellow feeling. And recently I saw an interview where American ambassador to Bangladesh was thanking Bangladesh for sending masks at the early stage of pandemic in the United States, where Donald Trump was in a denial mode and telling everyone that it's not a source of concern. So we do have, that sort of international collaboration. And now we see, especially in terms of climate change and so on, a growing kind of collaboration across the world, across the nations of the world. So international and global interconnectivity is not going to die down. It's still alive and it will continue. So we define globalization sociologically, and one of the things I try to do in my class, that I try to start with this negative sort of mode by saying what globalization is not. So globalization is not McDonaldization or Americanization. These are the very simplistic and kind of puerile understanding of globalization. Globalization is not Westernization, as we'll show very quickly. It's not capitalism globalized. Of course, that's the dominant kind of paradigm that has been propagated by media and some sections of the social sciences, namely economists, that globalization is only neoliberal, economic globalization. That's one form of globalization. Now we turn to Robertson, a prominent sociologist, and who first used the term globalization in the field of social sciences other than business. And he defined globalization as compression of the world and a growing consciousness about the compression of the world. So we have to really unpack, this very powerful definition. And we define globalization as a macro social process, which is entangled and contingent. It connects and it loosely integrates, transforms and gets transformed. It's a series of inescapable entanglements. And this is an interesting way, this is an important way of looking at it, to not look at everything in terms of very simplistic progression, that society, civilizations, they progress. No, they don't. They progress, then they get interrupted, things happen, and we need to be prepared. We need to be aware of all those contingencies and entanglements in history. So that's why we want to focus on history and the historical dimension of globalization. So in terms of changing, we look at globalization as a changing process, and it's multidimensional. So there are multiple discourses of globalization. Sociological, social scientific discourse is one, and we could refer to one of the essays published way back more than 20 years ago in Sociology. So globalization is not static, it's dynamic, it's multipolar. There's an excellent book on multipolar globalization by Jan Nedervin Pietres of University of California, Santa Barbara. And we define globalization, Brian Turner and I define globalization as a process must change and adapt to newly emerging conditions if we are to plan more effectively for global pandemics. We thought about it back in 2010, financial crisis, economic inequality, and imbalances in population movements through migration. So, you look at any of these topics, these are the important issues for the global community to think about and to see how globalization impacts and how globalization is constituted by these forces, by these processes. So roughly we can talk about thin versus thick theory of globalization. Now, thin theory of globalization, for which I use Thomas Friedman as a protagonist, who wrote a book called The World is Flat, and the book came out right at the first decade of the new millennium. And he basically thought internet and economy, that they're making the world flat, and globalization is simply defined as spread of neoliberalism. And his focus was, Reagan, Thatcher era of the 1980s, and the collapse of real existence, socialism. I mean, those things are important points in history. But the focus of this thin theory is on present, and that's what we call presentism, is one of its weaknesses. Now, the thick theory, which came immediately after Tom Friedman, Richard Florida, he wrote an essay called "The World is Spiky." Basically, the world is uneven. And sociological theory, we look at economy as an important variable, but economy is embedded in society. Economy doesn't exist, without any reference to society. So the process of globalization began a long time ago with earlier trade links, Silk Road, spread of religion, ideas, technology. So we focus, or thick theory focus, on history. So the thin theory, again, just to recap, thin theory of economic globalization leads to the theory of convergence, that the whole world would be homogenized, they would look exactly the same. Thick theory or sociological globalization, we focus on heterogenization. And one of the recent concepts that we have been working on is globalization. And we argue that one of the consequences of globalization is not the flattening of the world, but the world would be more localized, that there would be contents, global contents mixed with local strategies and local influences and so on. And we can find many examples in the literature on globalization. So just Google globalization and you'll see some of the discussions there. So if we accept the thin theory of globalization, then yes, deglobalization theory has some validity. That's what is going on. But the premise of deglobalization is a narrow understanding of globalization, which is economic globalization, and not economic in the sense of economic history that Krugman mentions. It's economics in the sense of financial economics, economics in the sense of global trade and foreign direct investment, FDI. But if we accept, and I suggest we must accept, the thick or sociological or historical theory of globalization, the march of globalization will continue. So I turn to the history of globalization theories, and maybe I can skip it. I'm looking at my watch, we don't have a lot of time. But we can look at the 1970s and 80s as a framework, as the backdrop against which globalization theory emerged. And in those days, there was an ongoing debates and discussion on civilizational or intercivilizational interface, intercivilizational encounters, and people like Benjamin Nelson, Talcott Parsons, they were all involved in that. And to a certain extent, Roland Robertson was part of that group. So that's what I call the Pittsburgh faction of globalization theory, where Roland Robertson was based, but he was very much connected with this intercivilizational debates and studies. Then we had John Mayer of Stanford, who developed this idea of world polity, and he looked at how isomorphic, and we can talk about isomorphism later, certain institutional developments have been worldwide, whether it's about nation state, whether it's about educational system, NGOs. So he developed his own school at Stanford, where they looked at globalization in that particular institutional framework. And then, of course, we had the great Immanuel Wallerstein, of world systems theory, and he provided, the world system ideas that we really need to look at world system or world as our unit of analysis, and not start with nation state, not start with national society. So, in other words, his insistence that we move away from methodological nationalism to what I call methodological globalism. He didn't use the term, but that's exactly what his intention was, that we need to focus on the world as a whole as our unit of analysis and not start with nation state. That has been the problem of social science for a long time. So there are many phases of globalization. Globalization is multidimensional. Excuse these slides, economic process. So there's an economic globalization, there's a technological globalization, political globalization, social, institutional, cultural, and so on. So if we look at the historical process, of course, we have to look at the flow of people, migration has been taking place worldwide. You look at Singapore, you look at Malaysia, you look at the historical aspect of transformation, transfer of people, technology crops, whether it is political ideas, communism. The idea of communism was developed in Europe, but the first and the second, not first communist country was still in Europe, but East Europe, not in the heartland of Europe. And then came China, and it was highly communistic and nationalistic. And the irony is that the ideology was imported from Europe. So we look at social institutions and so on, we find evidence of historical globalization. Now, to make the matter somewhat simple, I take this task of identifying 3 phases of globalization, where phase 1 of globalization started from 200 BCE to 1492. So I look at early connectivity, which were more regional, but had important consequences. And then that period ended in 1492, in the 15th century, when the second phase began. And the second phase, where the European rise played a very important role. Europe rose as the dominant sector within the world system. And that period is called Atlantic globalization, which lasted, from 16th century to 20th century. And why 20th century? Because after the end of the last millennium, we can see that new powers are emerging. China is making a comeback. It's not that China is emerging, it's more like China re-emerging again, after the first phase of globalization, where China had an important role. And that's what we may call globalization 2. And here we find, Amartya Sen wrote about it, when he talked about, this point that globalization is not simply Western. This was a misconception that he was trying to debunk. And he said, over thousands of years, globalization has contributed to the progress of the world through travel, trade, migration, spread of cultural influences, knowledge, science, technology. And he refers to this period, around 100,000 AD, so which is, in the Western sense, it was the Middle Ages, but it was not really Middle Age. It was a period of Renaissance, if you look at it from the point of view of Middle East and Central Asia, and East Asia. So this period included, invention of paper, printing press, gunpowder, and then the decimal system, which was well developed in India between 2nd and 6th centuries. It was used by Arab mathematicians soon after, and then it ended up in Europe. And these were important contributions during Eurasian globalization that I referred to, the first period of globalization, that made a significant contribution to the rise of Europe. And this is a history that we need to look at very carefully, the role of non-West to the rise of the West. So rather than presenting East and West as, in dichotomous, as binaries, we need to look at the connectivity, which was subtle, which was hidden, and sometimes not so hidden, and so on. So the takeaway points of globalization: it's a historical macro-social process. It's a process of processes. It's multidimensional. It involves cross-border mobility, connectivity, etc. So the ideas of cosmopolitanism, localism, locality, isomorphism are central in understanding globalization. Okay, so opportunities moving forward. Where are you going? So building global citizenship, and that's where I think your social science lab comes to the picture, because you are doing exactly what I'm going to suggest, that building global citizenship through global education and a cosmopolitan culture will help foster empathy, mutual respect, and appreciation of difference. Because we're not going to eliminate difference. We have to appreciate, we have to live with difference. And in order to live with difference, we have to appreciate difference, whether it is of biological diversity, diversity in nature, or diversity in culture, diversity of human societies. So a multicultural world and our diverse planet can be saved if we can avoid being parochial and overcome particularism, nationalism, and economism, which also entails destruction of nature and ecological diversity. So coming out of this economism or economistic analysis would be one important step. And as you can see, the present sad, tragic war can be explained in terms of nationalism. It's the so-called national interest of Russia, that was portrayed as the ultimate cause and so on. So COVID-19 has created opportunity for closer global cooperation and interdependence. But at the same time, we can see that, to quote Krugman, if we are about to see a partial retreat from globalization, advanced economies will end up only slightly poorer than they would have been otherwise. But I'm worried, and I, meaning Paul Krugman, is worried about the impact on nations that have made progress in recent decades, but would be desperately poor without access to world markets. Nations like Bangladesh, whose economic achievements and phenomenal achievements have depended crucially on its garment exports. Unfortunately, we are relearning the lessons of World War I. The benefits of globalization are always at risk from the threat of war and the whims of dictators. To make the world durably richer, we need to make it safer. Thank you. And now I turn the floor back to the organizers, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. And from this presentation, we understood that globalization is not just a process, it's multidimensional process that will continue and that will continue after that. So now we will open the floor for questions. There are some of us on Zoom today and also audience turning in from our Facebook live stream. So if the participants of today's Zoom audience has a question, they also can raise their hands, or you can write your questions on the chat box. So first question is, how has globalization contributed to increasing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic?
You want me to answer that? Yes, sure. Because some people looked at, again, very naively, that COVID-19 is a consequence of globalization. And that's a very naive way of looking at the world, because we could not have lived in isolated silos. If we could, then we could have avoided pandemic. But remember, pandemic could not be prevented 100 years ago. 1920, we had influenza pandemic. And then the world was not as integrated as it was in 2020. But yet we had a major pandemic back then, and that killed many more than the present pandemic did, 10 times more, 5 times more, depending on which statistics you look at. So that was a colossal pandemic. And yet the world was not as integrated as it has been since then. So lack of integration, lack of globalization as a prevention for pandemic is a naive view, Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. So the second question is, globalization is not Americanization, but post-Cold War globalization was American-led. The US has been significantly less enthusiastic about the globalization since the Trump presidency. What does it mean? What does this mean for international leadership and globalization?
I take your point. I think you make a good point, because this is a standard, and I think partly true or mostly true idea that globalization was led by American, sort of globalization, because as you know, the American history is a history of isolationism. America has been isolated willfully for a very, very long time. So American-led globalization, in terms of America opening itself as a market for China and for Bangladesh and for Vietnam and for other countries, yes, that played a very important role. And if you look at China-America trade, I mean, that's the proof where America played a key role indirectly. It's not that America wanted China to grow. No, it benefited American consumers as well, but it also benefited China, and it helped China uplift millions of people out of poverty. Same thing happened later in Bangladesh. But the interesting point is that although we call it America-led globalization, it's not that there was a big conference and America said, okay, from now on. No, there were institutional processes, there were historical processes. WTO played a big role, and China's membership to WTO played a big role. So what I have argued somewhere as Asian globalization, I think that in understanding that, China's participation in WTO played a key role. So it was, again, both multilateral, both multi-sectoral, both, multilinear, rather than just America favoring, certain countries. But, in the literature, we come across that phrase very often, American-led globalization, but it was slightly more complicated than that. But thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for your answer. And I noticed that Asif bin Ali, you have a question. Do you have a question? You can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Asif? Okay, he is not responding. So the third question is, how do you see globalization enabling or hindering international cross-sectoral and public collaboration in the face of global crisis? What can leaders do to ensure globalization does not create a barrier to forming community, solidarity, and also trust, which will be important for local action in the face of the climate emergency, disasters, viruses, and social impacts?
I mean, that's a very powerful question. That's a question that deserves a very serious response. I don't think I can do that in a few minutes, but I'll only try to address the question, because this is a very rich question. Because if you look at globalization only in terms of neoliberal globalization, where market is in command, market is dictating all the terms of reference, then of course, community is threatened. We can say that it will create a society without trust, and everything will be driven by money and nothing else. But if we broaden the definition of globalization, we can find many examples, where transcultural trust, transnational trust was built through the works of scientists, philosophers, people in literature, and so on, that we can think of an alternative globalization. Some people call it alter globalization. And here I refer to the World Social Forum. World Social Forum does not get the same amount of media attention that World Economic Forum of Davos gets. And that kind of, activity promotes community. World Social Forum, I'm thinking of, promotes community, promotes dialogue across cultures, promote dialogues across civilizations. And they actually provided, the intellectual resource for many of the global ecological movements, global women's rights movements, global movements of various kinds that would build community, and it would widen the sphere of community, because we cannot have communities only in terms of Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaft, the Tony's view of community, which is localized community. In the 21st century, we really have to redefine community. We can think of community as community of scholars, community of sociologists, community of poets, community of actors worldwide. And they can play a role in diverting our attention away or rethinking an alternative globalization where economic aspect would be not irrelevant. I mean, they're there, but that's not the only dominant discourse. They would be, working on other facets of life, other facets of community. And it's a possibility. I'm not daydreaming, because the writers who have been writing on this subject, writing on global morality, global ethics, and so on. So, but your question is more than that, and I cannot cover all aspects of it at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So now it's a question from Asif bin Ali.
Hello, sir. Hello. Good evening. My name is Asif bin Ali, and I'm joining from Bangladesh. I really like the way you argued about the globalization, that the contemporary phenomena, but the supply chain problems are not the permanent thing. It's a time being, and it will go away. My point is, at some point, you mentioned this concept of using nationalism as a framework to look at events in global history. And in academia, there is, of course, discourse about using nationalism and giving a nation state more priority over a global arrangement. And at some point, we see in case of European partnership with Russia was to some extent a step ahead regarding looking at world based on economic relationship instead of national sovereignty and problem between states. So what we have seen that the European states were very much dependent on Russia for gas and some other resources. And now when Russia was moving its muscle, using its energy as a muscle power to influence the European policymaking. Now, do you think this, from this globalization perspective, when Europe took this position of incorporating Russia within its larger economic structure, and then the way Russia is now using that muscle, economic muscle, to advance its war goal in Ukraine, has something to do with the new phase of globalization in the post-Ukraine war that may the world be expecting?
Thank you, Asif, for that question. I think because of sound quality, I didn't get all of it, but I get the drift of the question, which is the contradiction or the juxtaposition of nationalism with globalization, that nation states pursue national interest, and you were referring to European dependence on Russian gas and Russian oil. I think gas is more important in this discussion than oil dependency. And again, the countries in Europe are dependent variably. Like I just followed the discussion that Poland is not going to be as affected as Bulgaria, because Poland has diversified its source for gas and other energy resources, unlike Bulgaria. So different countries have different expectations and different consequences in this war, for example. But war is an unusual situation. Again, as Antonio Guterres said, it's an absurdity. So we cannot pin our discussion on war. But again, I mean, I'm sure the international relations experts, we have to picture that in. But we want to leave aside the war in the sense that this is an exceptional situation. This the state of exception, But dependence, it's not a question of dependence, it's a question of interdependence. It's a question of comparative advantage. It makes more sense for Germany to get gas from Russia through pipeline than to move around the world in search of gas, and it makes sense. But the question is, how do we overcome the war? That's the question, that how do we bring peace? Because with war, one of the consequences of this war that people are noticing, including me, that the defense budget, and the defense budget is a misnomer, it's military budget, or defense budget, whatever we can call it, has been increasing. And for last 60 years, you'll be surprised, for last 60 years, defense budget around the world was declining. And that's what people call peace dividend. And that peace dividend, the money saved from military expenditure could be used for environmental protection, for climate change actions, and so on. But suddenly countries are increasing their defense budget. US, of course, is the world leader with $800+ billion, close to $1 trillion now, defense budget. And the new aid package that they're giving to Ukraine, which is good, everyone is sympathetic to Ukraine, but that would make Ukraine 14th largest military spender in the world, ahead of Israel. Think about the consequence, the money being pumped into military machineries around the world, the defense expenditure. This would have collateral damage in terms of economic development, in terms of fighting pandemics and fighting all kinds of other diseases around the world. So we really have a terrible situation that the war itself is a tragedy, but then the collateral damage the war has brought in terms of excessive defense expenditure, in terms of turning the whole discussion from peace and development to containment, to war, to competition, the military rivalry. The discourse has changed, although I hope it's only for a brief moment. It's temporary. I hope we get over this madness as soon as possible and return back to more productive, more peaceful, more earth regenerating debates and discussions and conversations. That's my hope. But thank you for your question.
Once again, thank you so much, Professor Khondker, for your generous sharing. Thank you so much.
Yep. So thanks so much, Professor Khondker, once again. So on behalf of the Social Sciences Lab, we would like to thank all of the attendees for the talk today, both on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. And after this talk, it will also be made available on our social media pages. So for those of you who missed the chance to interact live, you'll still be able to watch the recording. So thank you so much, Professor, today for sharing out to us about globalization. Definitely, it's a very, very relevant topic with the continued progress, or maybe continued menace of the COVID-19 pandemic and the move towards recovery in many countries around the world. So the debate is always ongoing with the different events that happen and in the face of the different global crises that emerge and will continue to emerge. So we hope that all of the students and other members of the public who attend the talk today will also share some of your thoughts with us on the Facebook or via our other social media platforms. And if you have further questions, please also feel free to drop them and we can continue the debate at that time. Yeah. So once again, thanks so much, Professor Khondker, and with that, we will close the session for today. Thank you for a very great discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions and answers and for having me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you. I wish you all well and peace on earth.
All right. Okay, so now I've stopped the recording. Oh, Professor left. Okay, so thanks so much, everyone. Let me stop